Merry Christmas in July, friends! I'm Juliana Michaels, and this is my 4th card as part of my Christmas in July series. You can find a link to my Christmas in July playlist to check out the previous videos in the description box below. Even if you're not quite ready to start on your Christmas cards, you can always save my videos and come back to them when you are. My biggest hope with this series is to inspire you as you begin creating your Christmas cards, whether it's now or later. In this video, I'm sharing a faux bleach technique, which I shared recently using Distress inks. This time, however, I'm switching it up and using Distress Oxide inks. I'm also going to share some tips and tricks for adding sparkle and shine with Distress Embossing Glaze, embossing powder, and Distress Foundry wax. If you're interested in using the exact products I've used, I'll have them linked in the supply list below, and when you shop through those links, it helps support me, and I really appreciate that so much. Now let's get on with the making. To get started, I have a piece of Distress watercolor cardstock cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. I apply a bit of repositionable tape to the back side of the paper and then place it inside my stamping platform. The adhesive just helps to hold it in place along with the magnets. That way I don't have to worry about the paper moving around if I want to restamp. I'm going to be stamping this beautiful Poinsettia image from the Holtz The Poinsettia stamp set. And here I'm trying to decide where I want to stamp the image. I kind of like it offset just a bit. I then ink it and stamp it using ground espresso Distress Archival ink using my stamping platform. I'm using this ink because it's permanent and won't be affected when I add water or other mediums later on during the process. After I close the stamping platform, I'm rubbing over the lid using the Stampendable stamping tool to help apply even pressure. I then re-ink and re-stamp the image to get a nice impression. I want to create a border with the flower images along this side of the background, so here I'm playing around with how I want the images to overlap with each other. I then apply more ink and stamp the image again. To continue creating the border, I do the same thing, but this time I'm stamping above the first stamped image. After I finish stamping the floral border, I decide I want to add more stamping to the background using this script stamp from the same stamp set. But I don't want to stamp it using the same ink. I want something a little more festive, so I pull out my heat embossing kit to do some heat embossing. Before I stamp the image though, I rub an anti-static powder over the paper to prevent excess powder from sticking where I don't want it to stick. Here I'm inking the stamp using Versamark Watermark ink, which is my favorite ink for embossing, and then stamp it onto the background paper. Next, I remove it from the stamping platform and place it over a piece of printer paper folded in half and pour gold embossing powder over the inked image. I tap off the excess powder and move the paper to the side. I then use my heat embossing tool to heat set the embossing powder. As you can see, the ink from stamping the poinsettia was still wet, so the powder stuck to it. I'm just going to roll with it, but if this bugs you, make sure the ink is dry before you begin the heat embossing step. To create some movement across the design, I'm going to repeat this process and stamp the image in the upper left-hand corner. Now it's time to start adding some color to the background. Here I'm using a blending brush to apply Lumberjack Plaid Distress Oxide ink to the paper. I absolutely love how the oxide inks blend on Distress watercolor paper. They just blend out so smoothly. As I pick up more ink with the brush, I use a circular motion to apply the ink to the paper. I continue adding more ink until the center of the paper is covered with ink. I then wipe the brush onto a paper towel before switching to aged mahogany. I only have one brush for each main color, so since these are both red inks, I'm going to use the same brush. I then apply the aged mahogany to the outer edge of the card. I grab a paper towel to hold the inked background and protect it, but you could also use a piece of scrap paper. Because the ink is wet, your fingers will pick up the ink. For some reason, I always seem to forget about this until I'm doing it. As I apply the aged mahogany Distress Oxide, I keep working to blend it in with the Lumberjack Plaid. I then go back and add some more Lumberjack Plaid to darken it and continue to blend the inks. I continue this process of going back and forth between the two colors until I'm pleased with the blending. Now it's time for the faux bleach technique. Although I use the word bleach, there is no bleach involved in the process. The finished look just creates the appearance of what it looks like when bleach removes color from things, and that is why it's called faux bleach. Here I'm using a water brush filled with water. I'm rubbing the brush over the inside of the stamp design. Because oxide inks are water reactive, when you apply water to them, it re-wets the ink. I then take a paper towel and dab up the wet ink to lift it and remove it. And because I'm using so much water for this technique, I definitely recommend using a good quality watercolor paper that can stand up to a lot of water. Distress watercolor paper is my favorite paper to use for this technique, but feel free to try it with whatever watercolor paper you have on hand. I continue this process of watercoloring in the stamped image and dabbing off the ink to reveal the faux bleach design. You can go over the same area a couple of times if you like to lighten the color. I also like to refer to the actual stamp to make sure I'm adding the water to all of the areas that I want to remove the ink from. Here's a look at the completed faux bleach technique. Once the entire piece is bleached, I use my heat tool to dry the paper. Before I move on to the next medium, I'm going to use a slightly damp paper towel and wipe over the gold heat embossed areas. The ink I applied earlier when I was ink blending was dulling the shine. This is one of those things you don't necessarily realize until you wipe it away and see the shine return. Now I'm going to do some stencil work using the half-tone stencil from the mini layering stencil set and walnut stain embossing glaze. I'm going to use a finger dabber to apply Versamark watermark ink through the stencil to the upper left-hand corner of the background paper. If you want, you could use something to hold the stencil in place, such as a temporary tape or a sticky mat. I prefer to use my fingers to hold the stencil in place. Before you begin this step, though, make sure your background paper is completely dry from the ink blending, or you will end up with the embossing glaze sticking to anywhere that the ink isn't dry. Here I'm applying ink to a small section of the stencil because I only want the design to cover the corner. After I've applied the ink, I remove the stencil and pour walnut stain embossing glaze over the inked area. I then pick up the paper and tap off the excess glaze. Once again, I'm working over a piece of printer paper so I can catch the excess powder and easily return it to the jar. I then use my heat embossing tool to heat set the embossing glaze. Before I add the embossing glaze to the bottom right-hand corner, I've decided I want to add a little more stamping with this music note image from the same stamp set I've been using. I also decide to add this other little stamp as well. Now that I've figured out where I want to stamp the images, I'm going to ink them up with vintage photo archival ink. Again, I'm using this kind of ink because it's permanent and won't bleed if I add water or other water-based mediums. Before I stamp the image, I use a paper towel to remove some of the ink from the stamp so that the image kind of fades out at an angle along the bottom. I then repeat the same process on the opposite corner of the background, but with just the music stamp. Now that I have the additional stamping completed, I go back to the embossing glaze and stencil. I place the stencil in the bottom right-hand corner and use the finger dabber to apply the Versamark watermark ink like I did in the other corner. I then remove the stencil, pour the walnut stain embossing glaze over the inked area, and tap off the excess. I noticed some stray embossing glaze, so here I'm using my finger and then a small paintbrush to wipe it away. I then heat set it with my heat embossing tool. I absolutely love the layered effect I've achieved with the gold heat embossing glaze, and stamping. At this point in creating the background, I want to add some more interest with some splatters. Here I'm taking a Distress sprayer filled with water, and I'm going to use it to add some water splatters to the background. But instead of spraying, I'm unscrewing the sprayer and flicking the nozzle to add the splatters. So if you don't have a Distress sprayer though, you could use a paintbrush or even your fingers to flick the water onto the paper. Because the Distress Oxide ink is water reactive, the water activates the ink and causes it to lighten. You can then use a heat tool to dry the ink or dab it dry with the paper towel, which will lift the ink and create an even more dramatic effect. After adding the water splatters, I decide to ink the edges of the background paper with walnut stained Distress Oxide ink. Here I'm using a foam blending tool to apply the ink just around the outer edge of the paper. And this time I actually remembered to grab a piece of paper to protect the background as I apply the ink. The next type of splatters I decide to add is using Distress Foundry wax. Here I'm working in my splat box, just to protect my work surface. When working with Foundry wax, you need to shake it until the mixing ball begins to rattle to make sure it is well mixed. Next, I applied a small amount of it to my glass craft mat, and then added a drop of isopropyl alcohol to make it easier to splatter. I then used a paintbrush to pick up the wax and flick the brush to create the splatters. If you're not familiar with Foundry wax, feel free to check out my Distress Foundry wax video, which I'll have linked in the description box below. Distress Foundry wax must be heat set to make it permanent. If you don't do this, it will just rub off. So here I'm using my heat embossing tool to heat set the Foundry wax. As the wax is heated, it becomes shiny and at that point is permanent on whatever surface you're applying it to. One thing I do want to mention though is to make sure to recap the bottle after each use and to make sure you move the bottle away from where you are heating the wax. If the bottle gets heated, it will ruin the wax. Here you can see the gorgeous shine the Foundry wax adds to the background. I am loving how all of these layers keep adding to the depth and interest. Even though I've already added so much, I still feel like it needs a little something more. So I decide to add some black splatters using black soot distress paint. I apply the paint to my craft space and then use my paintbrush to flick the paint onto the background. Distress paint is more fluid than regular acrylic paint, but if you only have acrylic paint, you might need to add a little water to it so that you can more easily create the splatters. Now I feel like the background is complete, so I'm going to set this to the side and allow the paint to dry. To finish off the card, I die cut the word Merry using the Tim Holtz Merry and Bright die set. I cut it from black craft stock and then twice more from regular black cardstock and glued them together to create a little dimension. I then sanded the paper to reveal the craft core. Before adhering it to the background, I added a couple of evergreen die cuts I cut from green cardstock using the Tim Holtz Mini Holiday Greens die set. I then stamped the word Christmas using a stamp from the Tim Holtz Tiny Text Christmas stamp set using Versamark watermark ink onto a piece of black craft stock. I then heat embossed it with gold embossing powder, trimmed it down, and sanded the edges before I adhered it to the card. The final touch was to take a piece of gold metallic craft stock cut to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, sand the edges, and then layer it behind the background panel. Thanks so much for stopping by today. I hope you've enjoyed my Christmas in July series and are inspired to begin making your Christmas cards using some of the techniques I've been sharing. Until next time, keep on crafting. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.